Security escort her out. Those were my husband Marcus' final words to me before banning me from the company I helped build from the ground up. He thought humiliating me in front of our entire staff would be the end of the story. He thought taking my office, my title, and my dignity would break me. Instead, it was the exact moment his empire began to crumble. Days later, an urgent meeting brought every executive into one room. When a single file was opened, my husband froze and the room fell completely silent. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to burn down a kingdom you built just to teach someone a lesson. My name is Nia Sterling. I am 34 years old, and I am holding a glass of aged bourbon in my penthouse overlooking the glittering skyline of downtown Atlanta. The city lights stretch out beneath me like a sprawling chessboard. It is quiet up here. The kind of absolute power-infused silence that only comes when you know you hold the winning hand. I take a slow sip of the amber liquid, feeling the smooth burn slide down my throat. The ice clinks softly against the crystal glass. That is the only sound in the room right now. But my mind is constantly replaying a very different sound. The sound of everything shattering. You see, for 10 years, I was the ghost behind the machine. I was the financial strategist who turned Sterling FinTech from a desperate startup working out of a cramped apartment in Midtown into a financial juggernaut. I balanced the books. I structured the investments. I secured the capital when doors slammed in our faces. I did the grueling, unglamorous work in the shadows so Marcus could stand in the spotlight. Marcus was the charismatic CEO with the $1 million smile and the tailor-made suits. I was the loyal wife, the silent architect, the woman who traded her youth for our shared ambition. We were a young African-American couple taking on the tech world. We were supposed to be a partnership. We were supposed to be an unbreakable team. I gave him my loyalty. I gave him my brilliance. I gave him 10 years of my life. I poured every ounce of my soul into that company. While Marcus was out networking at exclusive country clubs and shaking hands with venture capitalists, I was drowning in spreadsheets and tax codes. I was the one who negotiated our first real office lease, when we barely had a dime to our names. I was the one who personally guaranteed the loans that kept us afloat during the lean years. I absorbed all the stress. I absorbed all the panic. I absorbed every late-night crisis so Marcus could sleep peacefully and wake up ready to conquer the world. I thought I was protecting my husband. I thought I was protecting our legacy. I was actually just paving the road for my own execution. It was a Tuesday morning. The air outside was crisp, and the Atlanta sun was casting long golden shadows across the pavement as I walked into the Sterling FinTech Glass headquarters. I was wearing my favorite tailored ivory suit, feeling confident, feeling untouchable. In my briefcase, I carried the quarterly financial reports I had spent the entire weekend perfecting. The numbers were flawless. Our projections were off the charts. We had reached the pinnacle. I walked through the sleek marble lobby, nodding to the receptionist swiping my security badge at the executive elevators. I walked into the building as a creator. I walked into the building as a founder. I walked into the building as a queen stepping into her castle. I expected a routine board meeting. I expected to review the spreadsheets and plan our next quarter. I never expected to leave as a criminal. I remember the exact feeling of the leather handle on my briefcase. I remember the smell of expensive coffee in the executive lounge. I remember believing that I was safe. I had built the walls around us. I had fortified our finances against every external threat. What I did not realize was that the greatest threat was already inside the building. The greatest threat was sharing my bed. The greatest threat was wearing my wedding ring. I trusted Marcus implicitly. I trusted his vision, and I trusted his love. That trust was a blindfold I willingly tied over my own eyes. I ignored the late nights. I ignored the whispered phone calls. I ignored the shifting dynamics in the office where my authority was subtly being undermined. I ignored it all because I believed in the empire we were building together. As the elevator doors slid open on the executive floor that Tuesday morning, something felt profoundly wrong. The usual hum of the office was missing. The assistants would not meet my eyes. The junior analysts suddenly found their shoes absolutely fascinating. A heavy, suffocating tension hung in the air. I walked down the long corridor toward the main boardroom. The click of my heels echoed off the glass walls. Every step felt like walking into a trap, but my pride refused to let me slow down. I was Nia Sterling. I did not cower. I did not retreat. I kept walking toward the door that would change my destiny forever. I reached for the heavy silver handle of the boardroom door, expecting to see my husband waiting with his usual morning coffee. I pushed the door open, ready to present the financial strategies that would secure our future. I was ready to smile and take my seat at his right hand. Instead, I was met with a scene that stopped the breath in my lungs. But to understand how a wife goes from the boardroom to the pavement, you have to hear the sound of the crash. The sound of a life shattering into a million jagged pieces. A sudden deafening crash of glass and metal hitting the floor echoes through my memory, ripping me out of the penthouse silence and throwing me violently back into that Tuesday morning boardroom. I stepped past the threshold, and the first thing I saw was a brown cardboard box resting on the expensive leather chair that belonged to me. The crash I remembered was the sound of my silver nameplate being tossed carelessly into that box, alongside my personal framed photographs and my favorite coffee mug. A maintenance worker was hastily packing away a decade of my life like discarded office supplies. At the head of the massive glass conference table stood Marcus. He was wearing the custom navy suit I had purchased for him just last month. His posture was rigid, and his jaw was clenched tight. He did not look like the man who had promised to love me through sickness and health. He did not look like the ambitious young man I had married when we had nothing but big dreams and empty bank accounts. He looked like a corporate predator preparing to slaughter his prey. Standing in the corner of the room, leaning casually against the floor-to-ceiling windows, was Brad Lawson. Brad was my sister-in-law's husband and our chief financial officer. He was a white man who always wore a condescending smile whenever I spoke in executive meetings. I never trusted him. I always knew he secretly resented taking financial direction from a black woman. He had spent the last 3 years slowly inserting himself into our daily operations, whispering in Marcus's ear, feeding his massive ego, and manipulating his insecurities. Now I knew exactly how deep that toxic manipulation ran. Marcus did not greet me. He did not ask about my morning or the quarterly reports I was clutching in my hand. He simply reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out 2 thick manila folders, and slid them across the polished glass table. The folders stopped right in front of me. I looked down. The top document was a petition for dissolution of marriage. The document beneath it was a voluntary relinquishment of shares and equity. I stared at the bold black letters, feeling the air completely leave the room. "It is just business," Nia Marcus said, his voice devoid of any warmth or shared history. "You have to understand that the company is outgrowing its origins. Sterling FinTech is moving into the big leagues now. We are restructuring the entire executive board, and you simply do not fit into the new vision." Before I could even process the absolute absurdity of his words, Brad stepped away from the window, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt. His smirk was infuriating. "I drafted those agreements myself," Brad said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "If you read through the bylaws I recently updated, you will see that your contributions over the past 10 years have been legally classified as administrative support. Clerical work, essentially. You have no actual equity stake on paper. All the intellectual property is registered under Marcus. You were just an uncompensated volunteer who benefited from living with the chief executive officer." I looked at Brad and then at my husband. I wanted to laugh at the sheer audacity of it. Administrative support. I was the one who engineered our first round of seed funding. I was the one who stayed awake for 72 hours straight writing the financial algorithms that their entire platform was based on. I was the one who balanced the books when Marcus was ready to declare bankruptcy 5 years ago. I built the financial architecture of this entire building. And now this mediocre accountant was standing in my boardroom telling me I was nothing but a glorified secretary. Your cautious financial strategies are a liability now, Marcus added, finally looking at me, but refusing to meet my eyes directly. You lack the executive presence needed for a global tech enterprise. Vanguard Equity is looking at us for a massive acquisition. They want a clean capitalization table. They want modern, aggressive leadership. You are an obstacle, Nia. You are holding me back. An obstacle. The woman who funded his dream. The woman who ate cheap takeout for years so he could afford premium server space. The woman who built the very throne he was sitting on was now an obstacle to his greatness. They thought they had cornered me perfectly. Brad had used every legal loophole, every corporate trick in the book to erase my name from the company charter. He had set up shell companies and redirected assets so that my sweat equity meant absolutely nothing. They wanted to strip me of my wealth and throw me out into the street with nothing to show for my loyalty. They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to cry and beg and throw the heavy folders across the room. They wanted me to act like the angry, emotional stereotype they could easily dismiss and invalidate to their new corporate partners. But I gave them nothing. I gave them a silence so absolute and terrifying that I saw Marcus actually shift his weight uncomfortably. I looked at the man I loved and felt every ounce of affection I ever had for him evaporate into thin air. He took my office. He took my name badge. He took 10 years of my youth. He thought he took my power. But he had no idea who he was truly dealing with. He had no idea about the blind trust. He had no idea that the very foundation of this company, the seed money that started it all, belonged entirely to me. He thought he was kicking me out of a building, but he was actually just locking himself inside a burning house. I slowly reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my favorite gold fountain pen. I unassigned the cap with a soft click. I kept my face entirely expressionless, masking the storm raging inside my chest. I hovered the gold nib over the signature line of the divorce decree. Marcus exhaled a heavy breath he had been holding, clearly relieved that I was surrendering without a messy legal fight. Brad crossed his arms over his chest, his smug smile widening into a victorious and arrogant grin. But before the ink could even touch the pristine white paper, the heavy boardroom doors were violently thrown open. The sharp, aggressive click of designer heels echoed like gunshots against the hardwood floor. A high-pitched, mocking female voice rang out through the room, shattering the tension and dragging the nightmare into an entirely new dimension. Well, 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 look who is still hanging around like a bad habit. The voice was shrill and painfully familiar. I slowly lowered my gold fountain pen and turned my head toward the heavy boardroom doors. Standing there, with her hand cocked aggressively on her hip, was Vanessa. She was Marcus's executive assistant. At least that was her official title yesterday. Today, she looked like she was playing an amateur game of corporate dress-up in a closet that did not belong to her. Because it literally did not belong to her. She was wearing a tailored emerald green Tom Ford blazer. My blazer. The exact designer blazer I had left draped over the chair in my private office last Thursday evening. The scent of her cheap, overly sweet floral perfume wafted into the room, completely clashing with the sophisticated silk garment. The audacity of the moment was so staggering it almost took the breath right out of my lungs. Vanessa walked into the room with an arrogant strut, her red designer heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. She did not even look at me at first. She walked straight past my chair over to where Marcus was standing and placed a manicured hand intimately flat against his chest. He did not flinch. He did not step away. He actually leaned into her touch, his posture relaxing for the first time since I entered the room. Brad chuckled softly from the corner, clearly enjoying the show. The final jagged piece of the puzzle snapped violently into place. This was never just a corporate restructuring. This was a complete and total replacement of my entire existence. The new executive team has a very tight schedule this morning, Vanessa announced, finally turning her gaze to me with a venomous, triumphant smirk. As the newly appointed Chief Operating Officer of Sterling FinTech, I simply cannot allow former administrative staff to hold up our merger preparations. You need to leave NIA, right now. Chief Operating Officer. The title I had bled for. The title I had sacrificed my 20s to build from scratch. Handed over to a 28-year-old secretary who could barely manage a digital calendar, let alone navigate a massive corporate acquisition. I looked at Marcus, waiting for him to say something to show even a fraction of human decency or respect for the woman who had built his throne. I waited for him to stop his mistress from wearing my clothes and claiming my life's work. But he just stood there, cowardly, hiding behind her arrogance and his crooked brother-in-law's legal paperwork. Vanessa snapped her fingers in the air. Two large security guards stepped into the boardroom from the hallway. I recognized them immediately. I was the one who had approved their background checks and signed their payroll checks for the last 3 years. They looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting their heavy weight from foot to foot and avoiding direct eye contact with me. "Madam," the taller guard said, his voice tight with obvious regret. "We have direct orders from the CEO to escort you off the premises immediately. Please do not make this difficult." I did not scream. I did not throw my heavy crystal water glass directly into Marcus's face. I did not lunge across the table at Vanessa and rip my emerald blazer off her shoulders. I knew that was exactly what they wanted. They wanted a chaotic reaction they could record. They wanted the angry, betrayed, and emotionally unstable wife stereotype to justify their ruthless corporate takeover to the Vanguard Equity Acquisition Team. I absolutely refused to give them the satisfaction of my suffering. I slowly capped my gold fountain pen, dropping it back into my designer handbag with a soft, definitive thud. I stood up from the leather chair, smoothing the imaginary wrinkles from my pristine ivory suit. I pulled my shoulders back and held my head so high my neck physically ached. Before I turned away, I locked eyes with Marcus one final time. I poured every ounce of my intelligence, my strategic mind, and my cold, calculating fury into that single, intense look. I did not look at him with the heartbreak of a discarded wife. I looked at him with the terrifying calm of an executioner holding the heavy iron lever. I saw his smug, confident expression falter. I saw a tiny flash of genuine fear dart across his eyes, because deep down, Marcus knew I was vastly smarter than him. Deep down, he knew he had just made the most catastrophic mistake of his pathetic life. I turned on my heel and walked out of the boardroom, the two massive security guards flanking me like a prisoner's armed escort. The walk from the executive suite down to the main elevator banks was the longest, most excruciating walk of my entire life. It felt like walking through a medieval gauntlet. Sterling FinTech featured an open-concept floor plan with clear glass walls everywhere. Over 300 employees were sitting at their modern desks. Nobody was typing on their keyboards. Nobody was answering their ringing phones. 300 pairs of eyes watched in dead, heavy silence as the brilliant woman who built the company was marched out by security like a common criminal. I felt their shocked stares burning into my skin. I heard the muffled, confused whispers echoing behind the glass partitions. I saw deep pity in the eyes of the junior analysts I had personally mentored. I saw sheer disbelief on the faces of the senior developers. I saw a young intern named Sarah cover her mouth with her hands as I walked past her desk. I saw everything, and yet I focused on absolutely nothing. I walked with the slow, measured, and dignified pace of royalty, leaving a temporarily conquered territory. They watched me leave thinking I was completely defeated. They watched me leave thinking I was a helpless victim of corporate greed and marital betrayal. They watched me walk toward the exit without knowing I held the financial detonator to the entire glass building right in the palm of my hand. We reached the elevator bank at the end of the long corridor. The heavy metal doors slid open with a soft, cheerful chime. I stepped inside the empty car alone. The security guards stayed out in the carpeted lobby, watching me closely as the doors slowly slid shut, sealing me away from the empire I had created with my own 2 hands. The elevator descended 60 floors in absolute suffocating silence. My reflection stared back at me in the polished mirrored doors. I looked perfectly composed and elegant, but inside a beautiful, dark, and destructive storm was rapidly brewing. The ground floor lobby doors opened. I walked straight past the marble front desk and pushed aggressively through the heavy revolving glass doors. The intense, oppressive heat of the Atlanta sun hit my face instantly. The loud, chaotic noise of the city, the blaring traffic, the chatter of hurrying pedestrians washed over me like a sudden wave. I stood on the crowded concrete sidewalk, gripping the handles of my handbag. A bright yellow taxi slowed down by the curb, the driver honking his horn to ask if I needed a ride away from the building. I shook my head and waved him away. I did not call a taxi. I did not need to run home and cry into my expensive pillows. I did not need to frantically call a high-priced divorce lawyer yet. I reached into my handbag and pulled out my smartphone. I bypassed my contacts and my business emails. I opened a hidden encrypted folder on my home screen and tapped a discreet tracking application. A detailed digital map of Atlanta lit up my screen. A small, glowing red dot was blinking steadily right inside the sterling fintech building high up on the executive floors. The dot was tied to a synchronized device that had access to Marcus's private vehicle, his encrypted emails, and his offshore personal accounts. I had set it up months ago when the company numbers first started looking slightly irregular. I watched the red dot blink on the screen. Once, twice, 3 times. Marcus and Brad thought they had just won the ultimate victory. They thought throwing me out was the end of the war, but the game had not ended in that glass boardroom. The real game, the one where I held all the collateral and all the power, was just about to begin. The transition from the blinding Atlanta sun to the cool, dark sanctuary of my penthouse happened in a blur of calculated movements. I did not shed a single tear on the ride home. I did not call my mother or seek comfort from friends. I simply walked through my front door, locked the deadbolt, and went straight to work. I sat in the center of my expansive living room wrapped in absolute darkness, save for the harsh blue glow of my laptop screen illuminating my face. On the screen, an audio visualizer spiked and dipped in perfect rhythm, with the voices transmitting through the speakers. I had not just tracked Marcus's location, I was in the room with him. 3 months ago, when he insisted on buying that absurdly overpriced Italian sports car, I was the one who set up the digital insurance and telemetry tracking. I synced the vehicle's internal microphone and his mobile device to my master security account for safety purposes. Marcus, in his infinite technological ignorance, never bothered to read the permissions. He never knew that his phone acted as a live broadcasting device whenever the car's proprietary application was running in the background. Right now, that microphone was picking up the unmistakable acoustics of a 5-star private dining room. The delicate clinking of crystal champagne flutes, the soft hum of classical music, and the obnoxious booming laughter of the men who had just stolen my life's work. I leaned back in my leather chair, swirling the aged bourbon in my glass, watching the digital sound waves jump. Brad Lawson's voice cut through the ambient restaurant noise, sharp and dripping with unearned privilege. "To a new era, gentlemen," and Vanessa Brad announced. The sound of heavy, expensive glasses tapping together echoed through my speakers. "I have to admit, Marcus, I was starting to worry you would never actually pull the trigger. But you did it. You finally cut the dead weight." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my bourbon, letting the familiar burn anchor me to the present moment. It was not just about cutting dead weight. Brad continued, his voice lowering slightly, taking on that conspiratorial tone he always used behind closed doors. It was about survival. You cannot run a modern global tech enterprise with that kind of aggressive, toxic energy holding the purse strings. Let us be brutally honest here. The corporate world does not want to negotiate with an angry, stubborn black woman who treats every budget meeting like a street fight. It is bad for the optics. It is terrible for the culture. We needed clean, sophisticated leadership. We needed to sanitize the brand. Sanitize the brand. The sheer audacity of the phrase hung in the silent air of my penthouse. He was talking about me. He was talking about the woman who had meticulously mapped out every financial projection that paid for the very champagne he was drinking. Brad, a man whose greatest professional achievement was marrying Marcus's sister and failing upward, was sitting in a Michelin-starred restaurant, celebrating the systemic erasure of my identity and my labor. I did not shatter my glass against the wall. I did not scream into the empty room. I simply reached out and tapped the recording icon on my screen, securing every single syllable of his bigoted, vile confession into an encrypted cloud server. They thought they were untouchable in their private VIP booth. They thought their secrets were safe in the dark. Vanessa giggled, a high-pitched grating sound that made my jaw physically clench. "You are absolutely right, Brad," she chimed in, her voice overly sweet, trying desperately to fit into a tax bracket she had not earned. She was always so rigid, so controlling. It was suffocating just working under her. "You are going to take this company to such amazing heights, Marcus. I just know it." The sound of Marcus clearing his throat signaled that he was ready to hold court. He was always addicted to the spotlight, to the feeling of being the smartest man in the room. Even through the distorted audio feed, I could perfectly picture his arrogant posture, leaning back in his expensive chair, soaking in their sycophantic praise. "You have no idea," Vanessa, Marcus said, his voice thick with smug satisfaction. "Today was just the first phase. Getting Nia out of the building and severing her legal ties was step one. But the real reason we had to do it today, the reason we had to move so aggressively, is because of what is happening next Friday." I leaned forward in the darkness of my living room, resting my elbows on my knees. My eyes narrowed at the glowing screen. "Next Friday. I have not told the full board yet." Marcus continued, the excitement bubbling over in his words. "I wanted to keep this completely contained to this table until the ink is dry. But we are not just restructuring the company, we are cashing out." A heavy, expectant silence fell over the restaurant table. I could hear the faint sound of a waiter pouring more wine before quietly retreating. "Cashing out." Brad repeated, his voice suddenly breathless, losing its arrogant edge. "Marcus, what exactly are you saying?" "I am saying we are selling the company," Marcus declared triumphantly. "I have been in back-channel negotiations for the past 6 weeks. Vanguard Equity, the biggest private equity firm in the Midwest, has officially extended a buyout offer. They want Sterling FinTech. They want our proprietary algorithms, and they want our market share." Vanguard Equity. The name hit me like a physical shockwave. Vanguard was a titan. They were known for aggressive takeovers and ruthless corporate restructuring. They did not just buy companies, they consumed them whole. "How much?" Vanessa gasped, her voice trembling with raw, unfiltered greed. Marcus paused for dramatic effect. I could feel his ego swelling through the digital connection. $500 million. Brad let out a loud, sharp curse of pure disbelief. Vanessa actually squealed. The microphone peaked violently as they erupted into chaotic, overlapping cheers. $500 million. $500 million. They were celebrating a windfall of astronomical proportions. They were toasting to generational wealth, to private jets and multiple vacation homes. They genuinely believed they had just secured the ultimate victory. But sitting alone in the dark, I was not panicking. I was analyzing. $500 million. Marcus thought he had executed the perfect crime. He had pushed me out, erased my equity, and lined up a massive payout all in one fell swoop. He thought he was an absolute genius. But Marcus had a fatal flaw. He understood technology and he understood sales, but he never truly understood the deep, intricate mechanics of high-level finance. That was my exclusive domain. I stared at the audio visualizer, watching their cheers fade into excited, rapid-fire planning. Marcus was a fool. A $500 million acquisition by a firm like Vanguard Equity did not just happen overnight on a simple handshake. It required a brutal, invasive, and microscopic audit. It required a flawless capitalization table. It required a completely clean balance sheet. And most importantly, it required the absolute legal clearance of all outstanding debt. Marcus thought he owned Sterling FinTech free and clear. He thought my forced departure removed all financial encumbrances. He was completely oblivious to the ticking time bomb buried deep within the company's foundational paperwork. He was blinded by the $500 million price tag. I slowly closed my laptop, severing the audio feed and plunging the room into total silence. A cold, razor-sharp smile finally broke across my face. Marcus wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate warfare. He wanted to sell my company to Vanguard Equity. He was about to learn a very painful lesson about what happens when you try to sell a house without owning the land it was built on. The harsh blue light from my laptop screen cast long, sharp shadows upward across my face. Sitting alone in the absolute darkness of my penthouse, I felt a terrifying sense of control. The city of Atlanta sparkled blindly beneath my window, but all my focus was directed inward toward a truth so explosive it could level skyscrapers. Marcus believed he had orchestrated the perfect corporate execution. He believed his meticulously planned ambush had stripped me of my power, my equity, and my legacy. He truly believed he had taken everything from me. But Marcus had always suffered from a fatal lack of curiosity regarding where his blessings actually came from. 10 years ago, we were nothing but a desperate couple with a brilliant algorithm and zero capital. Marcus had spent months pitching our financial technology to every venture capital firm in the city. Every single door slammed shut in his face. He came home night after night, defeated and angry, blaming the industry, blaming the market, blaming everyone, but his own lack of business acumen. Then, one morning, a miracle occurred. An anonymous private wealth fund reached out and offered us $3 million in seed money. Marcus strutted into our cramped apartment that day like a conquering king. He boasted about his natural charisma. He bragged that his pitch deck had finally won over the titans of industry. He spent the next decade telling magazine interviewers and podcast hosts how his sheer magnetic brilliance secured our founding capital. He never knew the truth. He never knew that the faceless private wealth fund was a ghost. He never knew that the miraculous $3 million did not come from a boardroom of impressed investors. It came directly from the calloused hands of my late grandfather. My grandfather was a man who built generational wealth through hardware stores, real estate, and unyielding paranoia. He was a brilliant strategist who trusted almost no one, and he passed that exact trait down to his only granddaughter. When he died, he left his entire fortune to me, but he structured it within an ironclad, irrevocable, blind trust. When Marcus was drowning in rejection, and the company was on the verge of dying before it even took its first breath, I made a choice. I did not just hand my husband a check, I protected my bloodline. I funneled the capital through the blind trust, masking the origin of the money behind layers of corporate shell entities and legal proxies. Marcus was so intoxicated by the influx of cash that he eagerly signed the funding agreements without ever hiring independent counsel to review the fine print. He just saw the dollar signs and signed his name on the dotted line. That arrogance was his original sin. It blinded him to the razor-sharp trap I had laid perfectly in plain sight. When Marcus and his corrupt brother-in-law Brad spent the last 6 months finding legal loopholes to push me out, they focused entirely on the surface-level capitalization table. Brad, the notoriously incompetent chief financial officer, used corporate bylaws to classify my 10 years of labor as mere administrative support. They gleefully erased the name Nia Sterling from the shareholder registry. They popped champagne thinking they had legally diluted my common stock down to absolute zero. They thought they had amputated me from the company body. But they did not understand basic corporate finance. You can rewrite bylaws to fire an employee. You can manipulate boards to dilute a minority shareholder. But you cannot erase a secured creditor. The blind trust did not hold common stock. Common stock was for amateurs. The blind trust held convertible debt. 65% of the company's total outstanding debt instruments belonged exclusively to a faceless trust that I completely and totally controlled. I was not just a discarded founder. I was the bank. I held the mortgage on their billion-dollar dreams. The convertible debt note carried a very specific and lethal covenant. If the company ever defaulted on a payment, or more importantly, if the company ever triggered a change of control event like a massive corporate buyout, I possessed the unilateral right to convert that debt into a supermajority equity stake or demand immediate repayment in full. Marcus thought he was selling a $500 million asset to Vanguard Equity. He was actually just trying to fence stolen goods while I was quietly holding the master deed. To sell Sterling FinTech, Marcus had to deliver the company free and clear. Vanguard Equity was an apex predator in the financial world. They did not write $500 million checks based on a charismatic smile and a firm handshake. An acquisition of this magnitude would automatically trigger the most brutal forensic audit Marcus and Brad had ever faced in their miserable lives. Vanguard would send in a swarm of ruthless, suited analysts to tear our financial history apart piece by piece. They would demand a pristine balance sheet. They would look under every rock and scrutinize every single ledger. This was the beautiful, inescapable reality of the trap. In order to close the deal and get his massive payout, Marcus would have to open the books to Vanguard. When Vanguard looked at the books, they would immediately spot the massive, crippling liability of the convertible debt. They would demand that the debt be cleared before a single penny changed hands. Brad would be the first to panic. He would stare at the balance sheet and see a massive financial black hole where their clear title should be. He would realize that they could not sell the company without clearing that debt. They would assume they could just throw money at the faceless trust administrators to buy out the note. They would assume it was just a standard institutional lender looking for a quick settlement. They would have absolutely no idea that they were required to negotiate with the very woman they had just thrown out onto the street. I smiled, feeling the cool glass of the bourbon tumbler against my palm. The ticking clock of the Friday acquisition deadline would soon deafen them. The pressure from Vanguard Equity would mount to a crushing, unbearable weight. Marcus and Brad would realize that their $500 million payout was being held hostage by a debt they could not afford to pay off and could not legally ignore. They would be trapped between losing the deal of a lifetime and admitting their financial incompetence to a major corporate buyer. Faced with the collapse of his ultimate victory, Marcus would not choose to walk away. His ego simply would not allow it. And Brad, desperate to secure his own cut of the wealth, would look for a way out. The strict, relentless audit from Vanguard Equity would back them into a corner so tight they would stop breathing. They would realize that the only way to push the sale through, the only way to satisfy the auditors and get their hands on the cash, was to make the debt magically disappear from the records. They would be forced to cross the line. They would move from slimy corporate maneuvering into the realm of outright desperate criminal fraud. I did not have to lift a finger to destroy my husband. I just had to sit in the dark, watch the audit demands roll in, and wait for him to eagerly dig his own grave. The sharp, aggressive clack of Italian leather shoes against polished marble echoed through the main lobby of Sterling FinTech. A sudden blur of motion swept through the headquarters. Camera flashes fired in rapid succession, illuminating the massive glass atrium in blinding bursts of white light. Marcus was holding court. He had invited a prominent financial news network directly into the building to broadcast his triumph to the world. Watching the live broadcast from the glowing screen in my penthouse, I saw my husband surrounded by a swarm of frantic reporters and eager sycophants. He looked absolutely radiant, basking in the artificial glow of media attention. The news ticker at the bottom of the broadcast flashed a bold red headline announcing the impending $500 million acquisition by Vanguard Equity. Marcus stood confidently before the cameras wearing a bespoke suit and a perfectly practiced smile of false humility. He did not speak about teamwork. He did not speak about shared sacrifice. When the lead anchor asked him how he managed to build such a revolutionary financial platform, Marcus looked directly into the camera lens and lied without a single ounce of hesitation. He claimed he coded the initial algorithms by hand in a cramped apartment. He boasted about his relentless drive, his unparalleled financial foresight, and his solitary genius. He painted a masterful portrait of a self-made titan single-handedly conquering the tech industry. He even had the sheer audacity to tell the reporters that his recent executive restructuring was a necessary step to trim the dead weight and sanitize the corporate culture. Watching him erase my existence on national television did not hurt. It only confirmed exactly how dangerously delusional he had become. He was completely intoxicated by his own fabricated mythology. He believed the $500 million was already sitting safely in his bank account. He spoke about the Vanguard acquisition not as a pending negotiation, but as a definitive absolute coronation. Marcus was not the only one drowning in a sea of premature arrogance. Through the synchronized financial alerts, pinging quietly on my encrypted phone, I watched Vanessa systematically abuse her newly stolen position. As the newly appointed Chief Operating Officer, Vanessa did not spend her first week reviewing operational protocols or optimizing employee workflows. Instead, she treated the Sterling FinTech corporate expense accounts like her own personal lottery winnings. The digital receipts flooded into my hidden tracking software in real time. Ping. $20,000 at a luxury jewelry boutique in Buckhead. Ping. $15,000 on designer luggage. Ping. $50,000 wired as a non-refundable deposit for an extravagant destination wedding venue. She was parading through the executive suites wearing my clothes, issuing tyrannical demands to junior staff and barking orders at people who had spent years building the company alongside me. She was booking first-class flights for weekend getaways and charging premium champagne to the operational budget. Vanessa genuinely believed she had successfully secured her position as the future wife of a half-billionaire. She thought the corporate black card was a magic wand that would instantly elevate her social status and erase her background as a mediocre secretary. She was spending capital the company did not actually have, burning through operational cash reserves under the reckless assumption that Vanguard equity would replenish the coffers by the end of the week. Both Marcus and Vanessa were standing on a fragile trapdoor, gleefully throwing a massive parade, completely blind to the fact that the heavy iron lever was about to be pulled. Their synchronized dance of greed and arrogance was loud, chaotic, and entirely predictable. But the corporate world operates on a very different frequency. While Marcus gave arrogant television interviews and Vanessa swiped corporate cards for diamond bracelets, the real mechanics of the acquisition were quietly moving into place. Vanguard Equity was an institution built on ruthless efficiency and surgical precision. They did not care about Marcus's magazine covers or his charming television persona. They only cared about raw, unfiltered data. The joyous, celebratory atmosphere inside the Sterling FinTech headquarters was about to violently collide with the cold, unforgiving reality of a forensic financial audit. The first sign of the impending disaster did not come with a loud crash. It came with the soft, sterile notification tone of an incoming email. Down the hall from Marcus's corner office, sitting in the heavily air-conditioned financial suite, Brad Lawson was casually reviewing the preliminary acquisition timeline. He was leaning back in his ergonomic chair, likely calculating his own multi-million-dollar commission from the upcoming sale. Then the notification appeared on his screen. It was a direct, high-priority communication from the senior auditing partners at Vanguard Equity. Brad opened the message, expecting a standard request for the sanitized summary reports he had spent the last 2 weeks carefully fabricating. He expected to send them the polished, heavily redacted spreadsheets that completely hid the massive convertible debt held by my blind trust. He thought he could just hand them a beautifully painted lie. But Vanguard did not want the summaries. The email was short, aggressive, and carried the full legal weight of a multi-billion-dollar investment firm. The audit team informed Brad that they were bypassing the summarized ledgers entirely. They demanded immediate, unredacted, and direct administrative access to the company's raw financial data servers. They required the original capitalization tables, the unfiltered banking histories, and the foundational debt instruments. They wanted to see the digital DNA of Sterling FinTech, and they were not just asking for digital access. The email concluded with a terrifyingly brief sentence stating that a team of Vanguard forensic accountants had just walked into the Sterling FinTech lobby. Brad stared at the glowing screen as the color rapidly drained from his face. His expensive silk tie suddenly felt like a hangman's noose tightening around his throat. The smug, arrogant smile he had worn since the moment he helped Marcus kick me out of the building instantly vanished. He realized in a fraction of a second that he could not send them the fake reports, and he could not stop the men in suits who were currently riding the elevator up to his floor. If Vanguard's auditors gained direct access to the raw servers, they would immediately discover the colossal debt held by the blind trust. They would see that Marcus did not own the company free and clear. They would see that the entire $500 million acquisition was built on a foundation of hidden liabilities and corporate fraud. The cold sweat of absolute terror began to pool at the base of Brad's neck. The Vanguard auditors had just kicked down the front door of their carefully constructed lie, and there was absolutely nowhere for him to run. Brad managed to stall the Vanguard audit team in the lobby with a fabricated story about emergency server maintenance and complex security clearance protocols. He bought himself exactly 12 hours. Now the clock was striking 2 in the morning, and the Sterling FinTech executive floor was completely deserted. The only sound in the suffocating silence of his corner office was the frantic, aggressive clacking of his mechanical keyboard. A bead of cold sweat rolled down Brad's pale forehead. His fingers were physically trembling as they flew across the keys. The harsh blue light of his triple monitors reflected in his bloodshot, desperate eyes. He had locked himself in to sanitize the raw data before handing over the administrative keys to Vanguard at sunrise. He thought his only task was finding a brilliant way to bury the massive convertible debt held by my blind trust. But as he dug deeper into the unfiltered financial ledgers, he hit a catastrophic landmine. Marcus had not just been arrogant and incompetent, he had been actively bleeding the company dry. Brad stared in absolute horror at the hidden transaction logs. Marcus had been secretly siphoning huge amounts of operational capital into offshore shell accounts for the past 2 years to fund his lavish lifestyle. Combined with Vanessa's recent reckless spending spree, the company's cash reserves were completely decimated. There was a gaping multi-million-dollar black hole right in the center of their balance sheet. Panic constricted Brad's chest. If Vanguard saw this raw data, they would not just cancel the $500 million acquisition. They would immediately report Marcus and Brad to the federal authorities for corporate embezzlement. The walls of the office felt like they were rapidly closing in. Brad was trapped between losing the generational wealth he felt entitled to and facing a very real federal prison sentence. Desperation breeds spectacular stupidity. Driven by pure blind panic, Brad decided to cross the absolute point of no return. He could not just delete the missing funds. He had to legally justify the gaping holes and simultaneously sever the convertible debt tied to my trust. To do that, he needed authorization from the foundational days of the company. He needed my explicit legal consent. Since he had proudly thrown me out of the building earlier that week, he decided to create my consent himself. Brad opened a restricted encrypted drive containing our original founding charters. He pulled up high-resolution digital scans of my signature from old administrative forms. His trembling hand guided the computer mouse as he meticulously cropped and isolated my signature. He began drafting retroactive board resolutions. He fabricated documents claiming I had willingly converted the blind trust debt into worthless common stock years ago. He created phantom revenue streams to artificially cover the millions Marcus had stolen. He was literally rewriting the entire financial history of Sterling FinTech in the dead of night. He thought he was being a genius. He thought he was saving the acquisition and securing his massive payout. He was so blinded by the pressure and the greed that he failed to realize the magnitude of his actions. By attaching my forged signature to fraudulent financial documents and preparing to submit them to a major equity firm, Brad was no longer just a sleazy corporate executive. He was actively committing federal wire fraud, corporate espionage, and severe financial forgery. He was meticulously digging his own grave and happily jumping right inside. His eyes darted back and forth across the monitors, double-checking the fabricated ledgers. The fake numbers balanced perfectly. The forged signatures looked flawless to the naked eye. He packaged the entire fraudulent database into a single massive encrypted file. The system prompted him for his final authorization. As the chief financial officer, Brad had to attach his own personal digital security certificate to the file, legally binding himself to the authenticity of the data. He did not even hesitate. He typed in his credentials and slammed his finger down on the enter key. The progress bar flashed across his screen, uploading the files directly to the Vanguard Equity Secure Audit portal. He slumped back in his leather chair, wiping the sweat from his face, letting out a long, shaky breath of relief. He actually smiled, believing he had just outsmarted everyone. He believed the $500 million was safe. Hundreds of miles away, the scene shifted entirely. The chaotic, frantic energy of Brad's Atlanta office was replaced by the cold, pristine, absolute stillness of a luxury skyscraper in downtown Chicago. It was 3 in the morning, but the city lights still glowed vibrantly outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Inside the dark, minimalist office, a single monitor illuminated a sleek glass desk. A perfectly manicured hand rested calmly on a wireless mouse. On the screen, a highly secure Vanguard Equity internal portal displayed a flashing notification. Incoming data transfer. Sender Brad Lawson, Chief Financial Officer Sterling FinTech. The progress bar reached 100%, and a green box appeared on the screen, asking to confirm receipt of the audited financial package. The manicured hand moved the cursor over the green box. With a single, soft, definitive click, the button was pressed. The screen displayed the words, "File received and authenticated." I sat back in my leather chair in my Chicago office, taking a slow sip of my bourbon. Brad had just handed me the murder weapon with his own fingerprints completely covering the handle. The trap was locked. The morning sun hit the glass facade of the Vanguard Equity Tower in downtown Chicago, reflecting a brilliant, blinding light across the city. I stepped out of my black town car, and the crisp morning wind whipped around my tailored charcoal trench coat. Walking through the towering, revolving doors of the global headquarters, I did not pause at the visitor desk. I did not wear a guest badge. If you were watching from behind, you would only see the confident stride of a woman who owned the very ground she walked on. The heavy staccato click of my designer heels echoed across the vast expanse of the Italian marble lobby, demanding absolute attention. Security guards immediately straightened their posture and stepped back, clearing a direct path to the private executive elevator bank. Junior analysts clutching their morning coffees quickly moved out of my way, casting brief, reverent glances toward the floor. They did not speak to me. They did not dare interrupt my momentum. I swiped my encrypted biometric access card, and the heavily fortified private elevator doors slid open instantly. The elevator shot up 90 floors in a matter of seconds, leaving the chaotic noise of the city far behind. When the doors finally parted, I stepped onto the absolute pinnacle of the financial food chain. The executive suite of Vanguard Equity was a fortress of dark mahogany, polished glass, and quiet, intimidating power. Standing outside the main boardroom was Jonathan Pierce, the public-facing Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Equity. To the rest of the financial world, Jonathan was the ruthless titan who crushed competitors and orchestrated hostile takeovers. To me, he was simply a trusted colleague who managed the daily operations of my empire. He offered a slight, respectful bow of his head, acknowledging my presence without needing to utter a single useless pleasantry. He reached out his hand and personally pulled open the heavy double doors of the boardroom for me. "Good morning, Madam Partner," Jonathan said, his voice hushed and deferential. "The acquisition team is assembled and waiting for your explicit directive." I walked into the cavernous room. 12 of the most aggressive, brilliant, and predatory financial experts in the country were seated around a massive custom granite table. The moment I crossed the threshold, every single executive in the room immediately stopped talking and stood up from their leather chairs in absolute unison. They did not sit back down until I walked the entire length of the room and took my rightful place at the head of the table. Marcus had spent the last decade believing I was just a highly competent administrative assistant who was lucky to share his bed. He thought Vanguard Equity was some faceless, monolithic corporate entity coming to validate his genius and magically hand him $500 million. He had absolutely no idea that the apex predator he was trying to sell his stolen company to was actually controlled by his own wife. I was not just a hidden founder of Sterling FinTech. I was the senior managing partner and the majority absolute stakeholder of Vanguard Equity itself. The firm was the ultimate manifestation of my late grandfather's blind trust. I had taken his foundational wealth and aggressively scaled it over a decade of silent, lethal investments, orchestrating massive corporate moves entirely from the shadows while letting men like Jonathan serve as the public face of the operation. I settled into the high-backed leather chair, folding my manicured hands on the cool granite surface. "Sit," I commanded. The 12 executives sat down simultaneously, the sound of rustling suits filling the quiet room. At the opposite end of the table, the lead forensic auditor, a sharp-eyed man named David, cleared his throat. He tapped his keyboard, projecting the heavily encrypted financial file we had received from Brad Lawson onto the main presentation screen. "Madam Partner." David began clicking a laser pointer onto the glaring red numbers highlighting the screen. "The financial package submitted by Sterling FinTech at 3 in the morning is an absolute complete fabrication. Our forensic software scrubbed the digital metadata within minutes of receipt. The chief financial officer, Brad Lawson, attempted to retroactively alter the company's entire capitalization table. He clumsily forged signatures to erase a massive convertible debt liability. He literally digitally cut and pasted past authorizations to make it look like the debt had been dissolved years ago. Furthermore, we found undeniable evidence of systemic corporate embezzlement directly tied to the CEO, Marcus Sterling. They have aggressively drained their own operational cash reserves to fund private offshore accounts, and they attempted to paper over the missing millions with phantom revenue projections. This is not just bad accounting practices. This is textbook federal wire fraud and blatant corporate espionage. David closed his thick leather portfolio, looking down the length of the table at me with absolute certainty. "The legal department has already drafted the termination paperwork. Standard corporate protocol dictates that we immediately withdraw the $500 million acquisition offer, sever all business communication with Sterling FinTech, and forward this fraudulent digital submission directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission. We have enough hard evidence to have the federal authorities raiding their Atlanta headquarters by tomorrow afternoon. We can end them today." A heavy, expectant silence fell over the boardroom as the executives waited for my final authorization to execute the kill order. I looked up at the glaring red numbers on the massive projection screen. I saw Brad's pathetic, desperate digital forgery. I saw Marcus's arrogant attempt to steal my legacy and fund his new life with Vanessa, using money that legally belonged to me. Sending them to a federal penitentiary right now would be remarkably easy. It would be clinical, efficient, and fast. But a quiet arrest was simply not enough. I did not just want to lock Marcus and Brad in a concrete cell. I wanted to completely obliterate their massive egos. I wanted Marcus to stand at the absolute summit of his fabricated mountain, thinking he had won the ultimate victory right before I shoved him directly off the highest edge. I slowly shook my head, keeping my gaze locked on the fraudulent numbers. "No. Do not terminate the acquisition." David blinked, visibly thrown off balance by the command. The entire room of seasoned acquisitions experts shifted uncomfortably in their expensive tailored suits. But Madam Partner David stammered, clearly confused by the severe deviation from our standard operational protocol. "The asset is entirely toxic. The liability risks are astronomical. They are actively attempting to defraud Vanguard Equity out of $500 million. If we proceed with these negotiations, we are legally exposing our own firm to unnecessary risk." I raised a single hand, silencing the entire room instantly. "We are not terminating the deal, David. In fact, I want you to do the exact opposite. I want you to push the acquisition forward with aggressive, relentless enthusiasm. I want you to call Brad Lawson this morning and congratulate him on passing the preliminary audit with flying colors. Tell him his financial package was absolutely flawless. Tell him Vanguard is incredibly impressed with Marcus Sterling's brilliant leadership and technological vision. Feed their delusions. Give them absolutely everything they want to hear. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cold granite table, locking eyes with the lead auditor to ensure my orders were perfectly understood. I want you to draft the final acquisition contracts today. Fast-track the entire legal process past the usual review stages. Set the official signing ceremony for this upcoming Friday morning. I want you to bring all the binding paperwork, the transition documents, and the ceremonial champagne directly to their executive boardroom in Atlanta. Jonathan Pierce, standing by my side, caught the icy, calculating glint in my eye. A slow, understanding smile began to form on his face as he realized exactly what kind of execution I was planning. "You want to close the trap while they are physically sitting at the negotiating table," Jonathan observed quietly, his voice carrying a mix of deep respect and subtle awe. "Exactly," I replied, my voice echoing through the quiet boardroom with absolute cold authority. Marcus and Brad think they have successfully forged their way to $500 million. They think they have sanitized their company by legally erasing my name from the history books. I want them to feel the intoxicating high of absolute unquestionable victory. I want them to put on their most expensive custom suits and gather their entire board of directors to celebrate their monumental payout. We are going to let them walk right up to the signing table. We are going to let them taste the victory champagne. And then we are going to drop the heavy iron guillotine directly on their necks. I instructed the legal team to pull up the master acquisition agreement on the main digital display. The massive screen illuminated the darkened boardroom, bathing my face in a stark, harsh light that cast deep, impenetrable shadows across the granite table. The 12 executives sat in absolute silence, watching me as if I were a surgeon preparing to perform a highly volatile and experimental procedure. I reached out and pulled the wireless keyboard directly in front of me. I was not going to let a team of corporate lawyers draft this specific execution order. I was going to encode the poison into the contract with my own two hands. Standard acquisition contracts are massive, dense documents filled with boilerplate legal jargon designed to protect the buyer from generic liabilities. They are hundreds of pages long, and 9 times out of 10, the executives selling their companies only read the executive summary and the final payout schedule. Marcus and Brad were notoriously lazy when it came to reading the fine print. Marcus considered legal review beneath his visionary status, and Brad was currently so blinded by the terrifying adrenaline of his own federal forgery that he would sign a pact with the devil himself if it meant getting the Vanguard funds deposited into his account. I knew exactly how to exploit their hubris. I knew exactly where to bury the explosive charges. I navigated to Section 4 of the Compliance Appendix. My fingers began to fly across the keys, the rapid, aggressive clacking echoing through the silent boardroom. I was drafting the first ticking time bomb, a highly specialized, aggressively expanded morals clause. In standard corporate acquisitions, a morals clause is a basic preventative measure. It simply states that if the CEO is caught in a public scandal, the acquiring firm can back out of the deal. It is a protective shield against bad press. But I was not drafting a shield. I was forging a specialized weapon. I expanded the legal definition of moral turpitude to explicitly include any undisclosed financial misappropriation, any improper diversion of operational capital for personal use, and any intimate fraternization with subordinate executive staff prior to the official signing of the acquisition. I essentially drew a precise legal outline around Marcus and Vanessa. I codified his secret offshore accounts, his luxury purchases, and his blatant office affair directly into the binding termination triggers of the contract. The clause explicitly stated that if any of these specific ethical or financial violations were discovered after the contract was signed, it would constitute a catastrophic breach of faith. But a breach of faith was not enough to destroy them completely. A breach of faith just canceled the deal. I needed a mechanism that would actively and violently ruin them. That brought me to the second explosive charge. I scrolled down to Section 7, the Debt Reconciliation Protocols. This was where Brad thought he had successfully buried my blind trust. He thought his forged signature had cleanly converted my secured debt into worthless equity. I needed to let him believe his forgery had worked right up until the very last second. I drafted a new, highly camouflaged subsection titled the Immediate Debt Call Covenant. I tied this new covenant directly to the Morals Clause and the Financial Audit Warranties. The legal language was incredibly dense, wrapped in layers of complex financial terminology that would make a junior lawyer's eyes glaze over. But the core mechanic was beautifully simple and absolutely lethal. It stated that if the sellers Marcus and Brad presented any fraudulent financial data during the acquisition process, or if they violated the expanded Morals Clause, the acquiring entity Vanguard Equity assumed immediate sweeping authority over all outstanding and historical corporate debt. Furthermore, the covenant explicitly mandated that in the event of such a breach, all previously converted or dissolved debt instruments would be instantly reinstated at their maximum penalty valuation and would become immediately payable in full, without any grace period restructuring options or legal appeals. I was effectively turning Brad's forgery into the very trigger mechanism that would activate my revenge. When they signed this contract, they were not just guaranteeing the accuracy of their fake ledgers. They were signing a legally binding confession that triggered an automatic and unappealable financial death sentence. If they lied about the numbers, the $500 million payout would instantly evaporate, and my original convertible debt would violently resurrect itself, demanding immediate payment from a company that had completely drained its own cash reserves. I sat back and reviewed the dense blocks of text I had just inserted into the document. It was a masterpiece of corporate warfare. The clauses were buried so deep within the compliance appendices, surrounded by pages of utterly boring standard legal boilerplate, that an anxious, greedy, and terrified executive team would completely skip over them. Marcus would only look for the page that listed his 9-figure payout. Brad would only look for the page that officially closed the audit. Neither of them would bother to read the loaded gun pointed directly at their heads. I nodded to David, the lead forensic auditor, who had been watching me type with a mixture of intense fascination and deep professional fear. Isolate these specific clauses, I instructed, my voice steady and cold. Embed them into the final binding agreement. Do not flag them. Do not highlight them in the executive summary. Let them blend perfectly into the standard boilerplate text. When you send the final package to Atlanta this afternoon, I want it to look like the most routine, boring acquisition contract in the history of the firm. David swallowed hard, clearly recognizing the absolute devastation programmed into the document. Yes, Madam Partner. The legal team will finalize the formatting immediately. It will be sent to the Sterling FinTech Executive Suite before the close of business today. I stood up from the granite table, signaling the end of the meeting. The trap was fully constructed. The bait had been carefully laid out. The mechanical jaws were pulled back and locked into place, perfectly concealed beneath the illusion of total victory. All that was left was for the desperate, starving rats to enthusiastically take the cheese. I walked out of the boardroom, leaving the executives to finalize the paperwork. I returned to my private office, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. The city moved with a frantic, endless energy below me, but up here, everything was perfectly calm. I checked my encrypted phone, tracking the digital communications flowing out of the Vanguard secure servers. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the notification chimed. A massive encrypted file labeled Final Vanguard Acquisition Agreement had just been transmitted from Chicago directly to the secure servers at Sterling FinTech in Atlanta. The package had officially landed in Brad Lawson's inbox. I pictured Brad sitting in his office, sweating through his custom suit, opening the email with trembling hands. I pictured him scanning the document, ignoring the dense legal text, looking only for the confirmation that Vanguard had accepted his forged audit. I knew he would immediately call Marcus. I knew they would crack open another bottle of stolen champagne. They were about to put their signatures on a document that would completely obliterate their existence. The contract was in their hands. The pen was hovering over the paper, and the moment the ink dried, they were as good as dead. The digital world allows us to exist in 2 places at the exact same moment. If you were watching this play out on a movie screen, you would see a perfect split right down the middle. Two completely different cities, two completely different realities. On one side, you have the warm, chaotic golden hour of Atlanta. On the other, you have the cold, sharp, absolute stillness of a Chicago night. On the Atlanta side of the screen, Marcus is standing in his sprawling executive office. The room is a mess of empty premium champagne bottles and discarded crystal flutes. The sun is setting behind the glass skyline, casting a triumphant glow over his custom mahogany desk. Vanessa is draped over the edge of that desk wearing a cocktail dress that costs more than what we used to spend on groceries for an entire year. She is holding a fresh glass of bubbly, her eyes practically glowing with unfiltered greed. Brad is pacing nervously back and forth across the expensive Persian rug. He has taken off his suit jacket and his tie is loosened, but a massive, arrogant grin has finally replaced the terrified sweat on his face. Resting in the dead center of the desk is an oversized digital tablet. Displayed on the bright screen is the Vanguard Equity Master Acquisition Agreement. The document is 350 pages of the most dense, sophisticated, and lethal corporate legal jargon ever assembled. On the Chicago side of the screen, I am sitting in the total darkness of my private executive suite. The only illumination comes from the glowing dual monitors on my glass desk. A single, heavy crystal tumbler of aged bourbon rests right next to my hand. I am sitting perfectly still. I am not pacing. I am not drinking champagne. I am watching a highly secured live portal that tracks the exact digital status of the contract I just sent them. The status bar on my screen reads, "Awaiting seller authorization." I watch the Atlanta feed through the synchronized telemetry app on my phone. Marcus leans over the desk and picks up the digital stylus. He does not sit down to read the document. He does not call his independent legal counsel to review the terms. He treats the binding contract like a terms of service agreement for a new smartphone app. He swipes his finger across the glass screen, rapidly scrolling past page after page of binding legal text. He scrolls directly past Section 4, the Compliance Appendix. He completely skips over the heavily expanded Morals Clause that explicitly criminalizes his secret offshore accounts and his blatant office affair with the woman currently leaning against his arm. He does not even pause to glance at the text. He scrolls aggressively past Section 7, the Debt Reconciliation Protocols. He completely ignores the immediate debt call covenant. He does not read the paragraph that clearly states any financial forgery will instantly void the payout and violently resurrect the massive convertible debt held by my blind trust. He breezes right past the loaded gun I pointed directly at his temple. Marcus only stops scrolling when he reaches the very last page, the payout schedule. He stares at the bold black ink that confirms the $500 million wire transfer. A loud, booming laugh erupts from his chest. It is a sound of pure, unadulterated hubris. It is the laugh of a man who genuinely believes he has outsmarted the entire world. Vanessa squeals with delight and wraps her arms around his neck, pressing her face against his cheek. She is already whispering about private jets and custom diamonds. Brad walks over and claps Marcus heavily on the shoulder, letting out a massive breath of relief. Brad thinks his forged audit actually worked. He thinks he successfully lied to one of the most ruthless equity firms on the planet. On my side of the screen, I take a slow, deliberate breath. The air in my office is freezing. My eyes do not leave the glowing monitor. Marcus twirls the digital stylus in his fingers. He looks at Brad and nods. Then, with a dramatic and arrogant flourish, Marcus signs his name across the digital signature line. He steps back and hands the stylus to Brad. Brad does not hesitate for a single second. He eagerly signs his name directly beneath Marcus, legally binding himself to the fraudulent financial certification he submitted hours ago. Marcus hits the bright blue submit button at the bottom of the screen. The split screen effect violently synchronizes. On my monitor in Chicago, the loading bar flashes a brilliant emerald green. The system chimes with a soft, definitive tone. The text on my screen updates instantly. Document executed by all parties. I reach out and pick up my crystal glass. I take a long, satisfying sip of the burning bourbon. The trap has officially snapped shut. The mechanical jaws have crushed their bones, and they do not even realize they are bleeding yet. They have legally bound themselves to their own destruction. They have signed their own corporate death warrants with smiles on their faces. Back in Atlanta, the atmosphere inside the office shifts from celebratory to manic. Marcus is vibrating with an intoxicating mix of adrenaline and sheer narcissism. The champagne is no longer enough for him. He feels like a conqueror stepping over the bodies of his enemies, and he wants an audience. He looks at Brad and Vanessa and declares that they cannot just accept $500 million in the dark. A victory of this magnitude requires a spectacle. Marcus wants a coronation. He wants every single person who ever doubted him to stand in a room and watch him become a king. Marcus walks over to his primary computer terminal. He cracks his knuckles like a maestro preparing to play a symphony. He opens his executive communication portal with access to every single employee, board member, and investor tied to Sterling FinTech. He begins drafting a company-wide high-priority mandate. He hits the keys with aggressive, heavy strikes. I watch the text populate through my hidden tracking software in real time. Marcus is summoning the entire board of directors, all senior executives, the legal department, and the key stakeholders to the main glass boardroom on the executive floor. He is not giving them a choice. He sets the time for this coming Friday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. The subject line of the email reads, Sterling FinTech, the ultimate acquisition and official signing ceremony. He types out a grandiose, self-congratulatory message. He mandates formal business attire. He declares that Vanguard Equity will be sending their senior partners directly to the Atlanta headquarters to finalize the transfer of funds and participate in a ceremonial signing. He demands that every single leader in the building be present to witness his historical triumph. He wants them all to watch him cross the finish line. He wants them to applaud as he becomes one of the wealthiest men in the city. He does not bother to review the email for humility. He simply slams his finger down on the send key, broadcasting his massive ego to the entire corporate directory. On my monitor, the urgent email intercept pops up instantly. I read the arrogant words Marcus just broadcast to his entire company. He has perfectly set the stage for his own public execution. He has built the arena, gathered the audience, and locked the doors. All I have to do is walk in and drop the match. I set my glass down on the smooth glass desk. The ice clinks softly into the silence of the room. I look at the digital calendar on my screen. Friday morning, 9 o'clock. The exact moment the illusion will shatter. The exact moment the empire will fall. Through the hidden encrypted security feeds I had installed across the executive floor months ago, I watched the final moments of their false paradise unfold in real time. Friday morning broke over Atlanta with the kind of blinding cinematic clarity that usually accompanies a massive revelation. Inside the main executive boardroom of Sterling FinTech, the atmosphere was nothing short of intoxicating. If you pulled back to take in the entire room in a wide shot, you would see a masterclass in corporate extravagance. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, catching the edges of the imported crystal champagne flutes that were perfectly aligned on polished silver trays. A team of high-end caterers had already come and gone, leaving behind a lavish spread of artisanal pastries, fresh fruit, and imported truffles that no one was actually going to eat. They were not there for the food. They were there for the money. Every single member of the board of directors was present, seated in their high-back leather chairs around the massive granite table. These were wealthy, oblivious investors who only cared about their equity multipliers. They were wearing their most expensive bespoke suits and designer dresses, checking their gold watches, practically vibrating with the anticipation of a historic payout. They had no idea they were sitting on a financial landmine. They only knew what Marcus had told them, that today they were all going to become exponentially richer. Sitting near the front of the table was Brad Lawson. He was adjusting his silk tie, his face flushed with the arrogant glow of a man who believed he had just successfully committed the perfect crime. He kept looking down at the thick leather-bound Vanguard equity acquisition portfolios resting in the center of the table. He was admiring the documents, completely unaware that the hundreds of pages of legal text contained the very clauses that would send him to a federal penitentiary. He thought his late-night forgery had saved his life. He thought he had outsmarted a global financial titan. Directly across from Brad sat Vanessa. She was occupying the exact chair that had belonged to me just 72 hours ago. She was dripping in brand new diamond jewelry she had recklessly charged to the corporate account the day before. She was wearing another one of my designer blazers, a stark white piece that sharply contrasted with her dark, smug expression. She sat with her legs crossed, sipping her champagne, looking every bit the triumphant corporate queen she mistakenly believed she was. She was already mentally spending her millions, completely blind to the fact that her corporate credit cards were mere hours away from being permanently declined. But the absolute center of gravity in the room was Marcus. He stood at the head of the polished table, commanding the room with a crystal champagne flute in his hand. He was wearing a brand new custom-tailored charcoal suit that fit him immaculately. He was soaking in the rapt admiration of his peers, breathing in their respect like oxygen. He truly believed he was at the absolute summit of his life. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus began, his voice resonating through the room with practiced theatrical humility. When I first started this company in a cramped apartment, I had nothing but a laptop and a vision. I faced countless rejections. People told me my financial algorithms were too ambitious. They told me I was aiming too high. But I refused to compromise my integrity. Listening to him through my earpiece as I rode the private elevator up to the executive floor, I felt a cold, sharp smile spread across my face. The absolute audacity of the man was staggering. He was looking his investors dead in the eyes and taking full credit for the grueling, sleepless nights I had endured to write those algorithms. He was taking credit for the seed money he thought he had charmed out of investors' money that had actually come directly from my grandfather's blind trust. Marcus raised his glass slightly, shifting his weight to project total executive control. We had to make difficult decisions. Recently, he continued, his tone turning serious and grave. We had to trim the excess weight and sanitize our corporate structure to prepare for this exact moment. Growth requires sacrifice. We had to remove the obstacles that were holding us back from reaching our true global potential. But today, that sacrifice pays off. The board members nodded in solemn agreement, completely complicit in my erasure. Vanessa beamed at him, raising her glass in a silent toast. Brad smirked, tapping his expensive pen against the table. In just a few minutes, Marcus announced, a wide, predatory smile breaking across his face. The senior partners from Vanguard Equity will walk through those doors. We will sign the final addendums, and a wire transfer for $500 million will be executed directly into our holding accounts, to the future of Sterling FinTech, and to the wealth we have all rightfully earned. The room erupted in enthusiastic applause. Crystal glasses clinked together in a cacophony of greed and celebration. They drank their expensive champagne, savoring the sweet, intoxicating taste of absolute victory. Marcus checked his heavy gold watch, his chest puffed out with sheer narcissism. "The Vanguard representatives are right on time," he announced, setting his empty glass down on the granite table. "Let us show them the brilliant unified leadership team they are buying into." Outside the soundproof glass walls of the boardroom, the sprawling executive floor was completely unnervingly silent. The receptionist had been instructed to clear the main hallway for the VIP arrivals. All the junior staff had been confined to their desks. The stage was set for a pristine, uninterrupted corporate coronation. But then a sound pierced the absolute quiet of the executive corridor. A sharp, heavy metallic click against the polished marble floor. Then another, and another. It was the rhythmic, aggressive sound of designer stilettos striking the ground with military precision. Inside the boardroom, Marcus paused, his hands resting on the leather portfolios. The board members turned their heads toward the frosted glass entrance. The footsteps echoing down the hall did not sound like a team of corporate lawyers arriving for a friendly signing ceremony. It did not sound like a group of men in suits coming to hand over a massive check. It sounded like a solitary marching executioner. The heavy rhythmic strikes echoed down the long corridor, growing louder, sharper, and more commanding with every single second. Click, click, click. The sound was deliberate and unhurried. It carried the terrifying weight of absolute, undeniable authority. Brad frowned, leaning forward in his chair, a sudden, inexplicable knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. Vanessa looked confused, adjusting the collar of her stolen blazer, her eyes darting toward the hallway. Marcus simply stood taller, adjusting his suit jacket, pasting his million-dollar smile back onto his face, preparing to greet the billionaires he thought he had successfully deceived. The footsteps stopped abruptly right outside the boardroom. For one agonizing second, absolute silence fell over the entire executive suite. The air inside the boardroom grew instantly heavy, thick with a sudden suffocating tension. The celebratory champagne suddenly tasted sour in their mouths. No one spoke, no one breathed. Then, without a knock, without a warning, and without a single word of introduction, the heavy double doors of the boardroom were violently thrown open. I stood framed in the doorway wearing a pristine razor-sharp white suit. The color was a highly deliberate choice. In a room full of panicked men wearing dark charcoal and navy, I was a blinding beacon of absolute power. I did not rush my entrance. I walked into the room with the slow, predatory grace of a lioness stepping into a cage full of trapped mice. My heels struck the granite floor with measured precision. Behind me, stepping in perfect synchronized formation, was the elite acquisition team from Vanguard Equity. 12 individuals in immaculate suits, moving like a heavily armed royal guard. Marcus almost dropped his crystal champagne flute. The triumphant smile instantly melted off his face, replaced by a sudden twisted mask of absolute fury. He slammed his glass down on the table, causing the expensive champagne to spill over the polished granite. "What is the meaning of this?" Marcus roared, his voice cracking slightly with rage. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me. "I gave specific orders that this woman was banned from the building. Security! Get security up here right now!" Brad jumped up from his seat, slamming both of his hands flat against the table. His face was flushed, a violent shade of crimson. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Nia Brad shouted. "You are trespassing on private corporate property. We are in the middle of a confidential multi-million-dollar signing ceremony. If you do not turn around and walk out that door this exact second, I am calling the police and pressing federal trespassing charges." Vanessa sat frozen in my stolen chair, her mouth hanging slightly open. She looked quickly between Marcus and me, expecting her powerful future husband to immediately handle the situation and protect her new lavish lifestyle. Marcus noticed the 12 suited individuals standing silently behind me. His arrogant brain completely miscalculated the situation. He assumed these were the Vanguard executives arriving for the signing, and that I had somehow intercepted them in the lobby to cause a desperate, embarrassing scene. He immediately tried to switch back into his charming CEO persona, smoothing his tie and forcing a hollow, desperate smile. "Gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for this interruption," Marcus said, stepping forward and extending his hand toward the man at the front of my group. "This is my disgruntled former administrative assistant. We are currently going through a very messy separation, and she is unfortunately having a mental health crisis. Please excuse her behavior. I will have her escorted out immediately so we can finalize the paperwork and celebrate." The man Marcus was trying to shake hands with was Harrison. He was the chief legal counsel for Vanguard Equity. He was a man who destroyed corporate empires for sport. Harrison did not reach out to shake Marcus's hand. He did not even look at him. Harrison simply bypassed my husband entirely, brushing past Marcus's outstretched arm, as if he were nothing more than a piece of cheap furniture blocking the way. Marcus stumbled back, utterly humiliated in front of his entire board of directors. Harrison walked directly to the head of the massive granite table. He approached the exact seat Marcus had just vacated. With fluid professional respect, Harrison pulled the heavy leather executive chair out and turned to face me. He stood at attention, waiting. The room fell into a state of deep, confused paralysis. I walked the length of the table, feeling the terrified eyes of every single board member tracking my movements. I did not look at Vanessa. I did not look at Brad. I did not look at Marcus. I calmly took my seat at the absolute head of the table, smoothing the crisp fabric of my white trousers. Harrison turned to face the room of completely bewildered executives. His voice was cold sharp and carried the unmistakable weight of billions of dollars. "Please allow me to introduce the ultimate authority in this room," Harrison announced, projecting his words to every corner of the boardroom. "Introducing the senior managing partner and majority stakeholder of Vanguard Equity, Madam Nia Sterling." The silence that followed those words was not just quiet. It was a suffocating physical weight that dropped from the ceiling and crushed the breath out of everyone in the room. It was the kind of absolute dead silence that occurs the exact second after a fatal car crash, right before the screaming begins. You could literally hear the soft hum of the air conditioning vents. The board members sat paralyzed, their eyes wide with sheer terror, realizing they had just signed a contract to sell their company to the very woman they had allowed to be thrown onto the street 3 days ago. I finally turned my gaze to Marcus. I watched the blood rapidly and completely drain from his face. His confident, rich complexion turned an ashen, sickly shade of gray. His legs actually gave out beneath him and he slumped back into the nearest empty chair. His breathing became shallow and erratic. He was staring at me, but his eyes were completely hollow. In that single fleeting second, his entire fabricated reality violently shattered. He realized that the anonymous seed money, the massive acquisition offer, the $500 million payout, had all been an elaborate, perfectly constructed illusion designed by his own wife. He realized I was not the tragic victim of his corporate takeover. I was the architect of his financial execution. Brad looked like he was going to vomit. He clutched his chest, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy double doors, realizing that the Vanguard executives standing in front of the exit were not there to hand him a check. They were there to lock him inside the room. Vanessa shrank down in her chair, wrapping her arms tightly around herself, looking at her stolen blazer, as if it had suddenly caught fire. The arrogant facade she had been wearing all week completely dissolved, leaving nothing but pure panic. I did not deliver a dramatic monologue. I did not raise my voice to match Marcus's earlier screaming. True power does not need to shout. It only needs to act. A slow, cold smile touched the corners of my mouth. I unclasped my designer handbag and reached inside. I pulled out a sleek, silver USB drive. The metal felt cold and heavy in my hand. It was the digital bullet that would put this miserable company out of its misery. I leaned forward and plugged the drive directly into the master console embedded in the center of the granite table. The massive presentation screen behind me hummed to life, casting a harsh, glaring light across the terrified faces of the men who thought they had defeated me. The screen behind me flared to life, casting a brilliant, unforgiving light across the long granite table. I did not say a word at first. I simply let the technology do the talking. A massive, complex spreadsheet populated the display. It was the exact financial package that Brad had transmitted to the Vanguard secure portal at 3 in the morning. I tapped a single button on my wireless console. The screen violently split into a side-by-side comparison. On the left was the true raw operational data of Sterling FinTech. On the right was Brad Lawson's desperate late-night fabrication. I pressed another key, and every single forged cell, every manipulated number, and every fabricated revenue stream instantly illuminated in a blinding radioactive red. The screen looked like a massive digital crime scene completely covered in bright red blood. My gaze snapped directly to Brad, capturing his reaction with brutal precision. His eyes went wide and his jaw practically unhinged. The arrogant CFO who had spent years talking down to me was suddenly struggling to draw breath. He gripped the edge of the granite table so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. The thick layers of expensive cologne he wore could not mask the sudden sharp scent of his absolute terror. "Did you honestly believe a global equity firm would not notice the metadata, Brad?" I asked, my voice echoing cleanly through the paralyzed room. "Did you truly think you could just copy and paste my signature from a 3-year-old administrative expense report to digitally erase a massive secured corporate debt liability? You left a digital footprint so wide and so obvious that our junior forensic analyst cracked your pathetic forgery in less than 12 minutes. You are not a financial mastermind, Brad. You are just a remarkably sloppy federal criminal." The board of directors began to murmur in hushed, panicked tones. The wealthy investors in their tailored suits leaned forward, squinting at the glaring red numbers on the screen. The reality of the situation was rapidly crashing down on them. They were looking at undeniable proof that their chief financial officer had just committed massive corporate fraud on their behalf. Before they could fully process the magnitude of Brad's failure, I tapped the console again. The glowing red spreadsheets vanished, replaced by a rapid succession of high-resolution banking documents, wire transfer logs, and property deeds. I shifted my focus instantly to Marcus and Vanessa, pinning them under the harsh light of the projector. "Let us talk about where the company cash reserves actually went," I announced. "While you esteemed board members were being told that profit margins were tight to justify withholding your quarterly dividends, your brilliant chief executive officer was secretly draining the operational accounts." The screen flashed a series of damning receipts. A hidden $2 million property deed in the luxury Buckhead district, purchased under a shell company for Vanessa. $50,000 for a destination wedding venue, deposit illegally billed to the company as an executive team building retreat. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in high-end diamond jewelry, designer luggage, and private first-class flights, all charged directly to the Sterling FinTech corporate accounts. I watched Vanessa physically shrink into the leather chair. The smug, triumphant posture she had carried into the room completely disintegrated. She looked down at the heavy diamond bracelet glittering on her wrist, as if it had suddenly turned into a venomous snake. She realized in that exact terrifying second that the glamorous, wealthy lifestyle she had been aggressively flaunting was entirely built on stolen corporate funds. She was no longer a powerful executive. She was an active accomplice to massive corporate embezzlement. The older wealthy board members turned their furious, disgusted gazes directly upon her, making her cower even further into my stolen white blazer. "You wanted to sanitize the brand, Marcus?" I asked, throwing his own arrogant restaurant quote directly back into his face. "Is this what corporate sanitation looks like? Bleeding your own company dry so your mistress can play dress-up with stolen investor money?" Marcus was hyperventilating. His chest heaved against his custom suit. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The brilliant, charismatic speaker who had just given a triumphant speech was completely paralyzed by the undeniable photographic evidence of his own greed. But I was not finished. The final layer of their destruction still needed to be laid bare. I tapped the console one more time. The screen transitioned from luxury receipts to highly confidential internal emails between Marcus and Brad. I highlighted specific paragraphs in bright yellow. These were emails where they explicitly and arrogantly discussed hiding the offshore cash transfers from the Internal Revenue Service. They had not just defrauded me, they had not just defrauded their wealthy investors, they had actively and intentionally defrauded the federal government. "You wanted to be a tech titan, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and cold. "You wanted the magazine covers, the television interviews, and the legacy. But you are just a common thief who lacked the basic intelligence to cover his own tracks. You thought you were demonstrating absolute power by locking me out of my own building. You were actually just handing me the undisputed, unredacted proof of your massive tax evasion." The boardroom instantly descended into total chaos. The wealthy investors completely lost their sophisticated composure. They started shouting over each other. One older board member clutched his chest, breathing heavily while glaring pure hatred at Marcus. Another investor stood up and began screaming directly at Brad, demanding to know how he could be so catastrophically stupid. They realized that their equity was not just diluted. Their entire investment was tied to a fraudulent company that was about to be raided by federal agents. Despite the overwhelming, undeniable evidence flashing in bright red and yellow behind me, Marcus's massive ego simply refused to accept his own destruction. His narcissistic brain violently rejected the reality of the situation. He could not process that the woman he had dismissed as an administrative assistant had just orchestrated his complete financial and legal ruin. Marcus pushed himself up from his leather chair, his hands shaking violently against the table. His face was a mask of pure, unhinged desperation. He pointed a trembling finger at the thick, leather-bound Vanguard acquisition portfolios resting in the center of the granite table. "It does not matter," Marcus stammered, his voice pitching higher, cracking under the sheer weight of his panic. None of this matters. He slammed his flat palm down on top of the Vanguard acquisition agreement. His eyes darted wildly around the room, trying to convince the panicked board members, trying to convince himself that he still held the winning hand. "We signed the contract," Marcus shouted desperately. "The ink is dry. You are legally bound to this deal, Nia. You represent Vanguard Equity, and Vanguard officially accepted our terms. We executed the agreement this morning. You cannot just back out now because you are angry. You owe us $500 million. He looked around the chaotic boardroom, a desperate manic smile slowly forming on his sweating face. He clung to the heavy leather portfolio as if it were a life raft in a hurricane. He truly believed the legal binding of the corporate paperwork would somehow shield him from the crimes he had committed. "The deal is done," Marcus insisted, laughing a breathless, hollow laugh. "The contract is binding. We are safe. You have to pay us." I did not raise my voice to shout over his manic laughter. I let him clutch that leather-bound portfolio like a drowning man holding onto a broken piece of wood. My gaze swept slowly and deliberately across the massive granite table, taking in the absolute wreckage of the room. I watched the wealthy board members pulling out their phones with trembling hands, desperately trying to salvage whatever external capital they had left. I watched Vanessa hyperventilating her manicured fingers, shaking so violently that her stolen diamond bracelets clattered loudly against the glass tabletop. I watched Brad physically folding in on himself, his face buried deep in his hands, completely broken by the crushing weight of his own hubris. Finally, my eyes locked back onto Marcus. My expression was carved from solid ice. I raised my hand and tapped my index finger against the polished granite. Tap, tap, tap. The sharp, rhythmic sound cut cleanly through the chaotic shouting of the board members. It was a singular, commanding noise that demanded absolute compliance. The room slowly fell back into a breathless, terrified silence. Everyone turned to look at me, waiting for the final verdict. "You are absolutely right, Marcus," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave that forced everyone in the room to lean forward just to hear the words. "The contract you signed this morning is entirely binding. It is a masterpiece of corporate law. But your fatal flaw has always been your monumental arrogance. You were so blinded by the 9-figure payout on the final page that you never bothered to read the terms of your own execution." I gestured to Harrison, the chief legal counsel standing stoically by my side. He handed me a crisp, printed copy of the master acquisition agreement. I dropped it onto the table directly in front of Marcus and opened it to Section 4. "I suggest you turn your attention to the compliance appendix, Marcus," I instructed, my tone echoing with cold authority. "Specifically, the expanded morals clause. You see, standard contracts protect buyers from bad public relations. But the contract you eagerly signed at 3 a.m. explicitly criminalizes undisclosed financial misappropriation, the diversion of operational capital for personal use, and intimate fraternization with subordinate executive staff prior to the official signing." I shifted my gaze directly to Vanessa, who let out a sharp, pathetic gasp, shrinking even further into her chair. "You essentially signed a legally binding confession, Marcus," I continued, keeping my eyes locked on his pale, sweating face. "Your secret offshore accounts and your blatant office affair are not just embarrassing personal failures. They are catastrophic contractual breaches. Because you violated this highly specific ethical clause, the $500 million Vanguard payout is instantly null and void. Vanguard Equity is not transferring a single dime into your account. The acquisition is canceled by your own hand." Marcus's manic, desperate smile finally collapsed completely. The leather portfolio slipped from his sweaty fingers and slid across the polished granite table. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. But losing the payout was merely the beginning of the nightmare. I was not just there to cancel his victory. I was there to scorch the earth. I slowly turned the pages of the contract to Section 7. "But canceling the deal was simply not enough for me, Marcus," I stated, leaning forward slightly. "I needed you to pay for what you actively tried to steal. You and Brad thought you successfully forged away the blind trust. You thought you digitally erased the foundational debt of this entire company. But Section 7 contains a heavily camouflaged, immediate debt call covenant. It explicitly dictates that in the event of fraudulent financial certification or a catastrophic breach of the morals clause, the acquiring entity assumes immediate sweeping authority over all historical corporate debt. I stood up slowly from the head of the table, buttoning my crisp white blazer. My shadow fell long and heavy across Marcus's trembling form. Furthermore, the covenant clearly dictates that any previously dissolved or altered debt instruments are instantly reinstated at their absolute maximum penalty valuation. I announced, ensuring every single board member heard the financial reality of the situation. Brad's pathetic digital forgery did not erase my trust. It simply activated the penalty multiplier. Your fraudulent signatures legally resurrected the absolute monster you tried so desperately to bury. I rested my hands flat on the cool granite table, bringing my face mere inches from my husband's terrified hollow eyes. As the senior managing partner of Vanguard Equity and the sole controlling beneficiary of the original blind trust, I am officially executing my absolute right to call the debt. You owe the trust $150 million. And because of the acceleration clause you willingly signed less than 8 hours ago, it is not due in 30 days. It is not due next week. It is payable in full immediately, right here, right now. Marcus stared at me, his jaw trembling violently. His mind desperately scrambled to calculate the numbers, but he already knew the devastating mathematical truth. He had aggressively drained the operational cash reserves to buy Vanessa's luxury Buckhead mansion and fund his lavish, arrogant lifestyle. Brad's fake revenue streams were just useless pixels on a computer screen. The company bank accounts were completely decimated. There was no secret corporate reserve. There was no miraculous venture capital bailout waiting in the wings. He did not have $150 million. He did not even have a fraction of it. I watched the exact second his soul shattered. His eyes glazed over as the catastrophic reality of his situation crushed him. He could not pay the debt. By legally demanding immediate repayment, I was forcing Sterling FinTech into automatic default. The silence in the boardroom was absolute and suffocating. The wealthy investors stared at Marcus with unadulterated hatred, realizing he had just steered their golden ship directly into an explosive minefield. The brilliant tech titan, the self-proclaimed solitary genius, the man who thought he could discard his wife like a piece of broken administrative trash had just legally bankrupted his own empire right in front of his entire board of directors. Sterling FinTech was officially dead, and Marcus was the one who proudly pulled the trigger. The room instantly fractured into raw, unfiltered chaos. If you were capturing this moment through a camera lens, the frame would be shaking violently, jerking from one panicked face to another. The polished, civilized facade of corporate America completely dissolved into animalistic survival instinct. Harrison stepped forward to deliver the final legal blow. His voice cut through the shouting board members like a steel blade. As chief legal counsel for Vanguard Equity, Harrison announced, projecting over the escalating noise, "I hereby declare the immediate and total seizure of all Sterling FinTech physical and intellectual assets. Effective as of this exact second, your common stock is officially valued at 0. Every single share you hold is nothing but worthless scrap paper." The wealthy investors erupted. Chairs were shoved backwards, scraping harshly against the granite floor. Older men in expensive suits were practically screaming into their mobile phones, desperately trying to reach their personal wealth managers to mitigate the catastrophic damage. But it was far too late. They had bet their fortunes on a man who had built a castle on quicksand. Marcus remained slumped in his chair, utterly paralyzed. His mouth opened and closed, but he could not form a single coherent word. He just stared blankly at the projected screen, where his entire fraudulent history was still burning in bright radioactive red. The reality of the financial seizure finally pierced through Vanessa's shock. Her parasitic survival instincts aggressively kicked in. She scrambled out of my stolen leather chair and frantically dug into her designer handbag. She pulled out her smartphone, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped it onto the floor. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers stabbing desperately at the glass screen. She was trying to log into the corporate banking portals. She was trying to execute an emergency wire transfer to sweep whatever remaining stolen capital she could find directly into her personal offshore accounts. She wanted to grab the cash and run before the federal authorities arrived. She tapped the screen again and again, her breathing turning into ragged, panicked gasps. Then a stark error message popped up, illuminating her terrified face. Access denied. Account frozen by Vanguard Equity Administration. Vanessa let out a sharp, hysterical sob. She dumped the contents of her purse directly onto the granite table. Lipsticks, designer sunglasses, and a stack of premium corporate credit cards spilled out. She grabbed the black platinum cards as if they were oxygen. They were the magic keys to her brand new wealthy identity. But she looked up and met my icy gaze, and she knew instantly that those pieces of plastic were entirely dead. I had legally severed her access to the financial system the exact second the contract was signed. She was utterly broke. The realization that she was not going to be a billionaire's wife, that she was completely ruined and tied to a massive federal crime, broke her mind entirely. Vanessa spun around and turned her absolute fury directly onto Marcus. "You lied to me," Vanessa screamed, her voice cracking with raw, unhinged rage. She grabbed the useless corporate credit cards and threw them aggressively, hitting Marcus directly in the chest. "You told me we were safe. You told me you own this company. You are nothing but a pathetic, broke liar. You dragged me into this mess. You ruined my entire life." Marcus did not even flinch when the plastic cards hit him. He was completely catatonic, lost in the terrifying void of his own destruction. Vanessa continued to wail, cursing him with every vile word she could summon, crying over the luxury cars and mansions that had just evaporated into thin air. She was a rat fleeing a sinking ship, but she had absolutely nowhere to swim. On the opposite side of the boardroom, Brad Lawson was quietly backing away from the table. He had watched the investors panic. He had watched Vanessa absolutely lose her mind. And he knew with terrifying clarity what was coming next for him. He had committed the digital forgery. His personal security certificate was permanently stamped on the fraudulent audit files currently sitting on the Vanguard servers. The financial ruin of the company was devastating, but the federal prison sentence waiting for him was a death knell. Brad turned away from the chaos and bolted toward the heavy double doors at the back of the executive boardroom. He moved with the frantic, sloppy speed of a man running for his life. He thought he could slip out during the screaming match and disappear into the crowded Atlanta streets before the authorities arrived. He reached the exit and grabbed the heavy brass handles, pulling with all of his panicked, desperate strength. The doors did not move an inch. Brad yanked the handles again and again, his chest heaving, his expensive silk tie flapping wildly. He threw his entire body weight against the thick wood, letting out a pathetic, desperate groan. He was trapped. The 12 Vanguard executives had stepped seamlessly into an impenetrable wall blocking the only exit. Nobody was leaving this room. The heavy brass handles began to turn slowly from the outside. The 12 Vanguard executives parted in flawless synchronization, creating a clear pathway to the center of the boardroom. The perspective of the room seemed to violently tilt on its axis. If you were viewing this through a camera lens, the entire world would appear angled and severely skewed, perfectly capturing the dizzying, sickening vertigo of an empire collapsing upside down. The heavy double doors swung open, and the absolute finality of the trap stepped across the threshold. A team of federal agents strode into the room. They wore dark navy windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation emblazoned across their chests. Vanguard Equity had not just flagged the fraudulent financial files internally. The second Brad transmitted the forged audit containing my digitally manipulated signature and the fabricated revenue streams across state lines, Harrison had immediately forwarded the entire encrypted package to the federal authorities. We had handed the FBI a perfectly wrapped federal wire fraud case tied with a neat little bow. Brad Lawson took one look at the federal agents, and his legs completely gave out beneath him. The arrogant chief financial officer who had spent years plotting my removal collapsed into a pathetic heap on the polished granite floor. The expensive tailored silk suit he wore crumpled around him like cheap tissue paper. He did not try to run anymore. He did not try to negotiate or call for his high-priced corporate lawyers. The crushing, terrifying reality of a 20-year federal prison sentence hit him with the force of a freight train. Brad dropped to his knees, pressing his hands together, and began to openly, violently sob right in front of the entire board of directors. He scrambled on his hands and knees toward the federal agents, sobbing uncontrollably and screaming out a frantic, pathetic confession. He babbled wildly, pointing his shaking finger directly at Marcus. He cried that Marcus had forced him to do it, that the offshore accounts were all Marcus's idea, that he had only forged my signature because he was terrified of losing his job. He begged for immunity. He begged for a plea deal. He groveled on the floor of the boardroom, stripping away every single ounce of his dignity in a desperate bid to save his own skin. The federal agents remained entirely stone-faced. They hauled Brad off the floor, roughly twisting his arms behind his back and reciting his Miranda rights in a cold, mechanical monotone. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoing through the room sounded like a closing vault door. Across the room, Marcus watched his brother-in-law weeping on the floor. He watched the federal agents securing the perimeter. He looked at the wealthy board members who were now aggressively backing away from him, treating him like a highly contagious disease. He looked at Vanessa, who was curled into a ball in the corner, crying hysterically over her frozen credit cards. Every single pillar of his fabricated genius had been systematically obliterated. The total destruction of his massive ego triggered an instantaneous and terrifying psychological break. Marcus slowly turned his head to look at me, sitting calmly at the head of the table. The charming, charismatic CEO persona completely melted away, leaving behind a hollow, feral, and violently unhinged predator. He realized that I had orchestrated every single second of his absolute humiliation. I had let him climb to the very peak of his imaginary mountain just so I could push him off the edge myself. Pure irrational rage consumed whatever rational thought he had left. Marcus let out a guttural primal scream that tore through his throat. He vaulted violently over the heavy leather chair, his eyes completely wide and bloodshot. He lunged directly across the massive granite table, sending crystal champagne flutes and silver trays crashing to the floor in a shower of shattered glass. He was not trying to salvage the company anymore. He was not trying to talk his way out of the fraud charges. He simply wanted to destroy the woman who had effortlessly outsmarted him. He reached his hands out, his fingers curling into claws, aiming directly for my throat. I did not flinch. I did not scream. I did not even blink. I sat perfectly still in my pristine white suit, watching him fly across the table like a rabid animal. Before his hands could get anywhere near me, the Vanguard private security detail executed their orders with terrifying, lethal precision. Two massive bodyguards who had been standing silently in the shadows of the room intercepted Marcus mid-air. One of the guards grabbed Marcus's outstretched right arm and twisted it violently behind his back with aggressive, unapologetic force. A sickening, sharp crack echoed loudly over the chaos of the room as the bone gave way. Marcus screamed in absolute blinding agony, his face contorting in pain. The second bodyguard grabbed him by the back of the neck and slammed him viciously downward. Marcus's face hit the freezing, cold, polished granite tabletop with a heavy, bone-jarring thud. The bodyguards pinned him flat against the stone, pressing his cheek directly against the glowing red projection of his own fraudulent financial audit. He thrashed and kicked against the table, groaning in pain as the security team held him completely immobilized beneath their crushing weight. I slowly stood up from the executive leather chair. The entire room fell into a terrified, breathless hush, watching my every movement. I walked gracefully around the edge of the granite table, my heels clicking softly against the floor, until I was standing directly over my husband. Marcus was gasping for air, his face pressed awkwardly against the cold stone, his broken arm pinned uselessly behind his back. He rolled his eyes upward to look at me, his expression a pathetic mixture of physical agony and absolute defeat. I leaned down slowly, letting the silence stretch out, allowing him to feel the immense crushing pressure of his total failure. I lowered my face until my lips were hovering mere inches from his ear. "You told them to escort me out of my building, Marcus." I whispered, my voice barely a breath, but carrying the razor-sharp edge of absolute authority. Now I am having you escorted out of mine. You escorted. I stood back up and smoothed the lapels of my white blazer. I gave a single sharp nod to the federal agent standing by the door. The agents moved in swiftly, hauling Marcus off the granite table. They yanked his arms behind his back, ignoring his cries of pain as the steel handcuffs snapped tightly around his wrists. They dragged him forcefully toward the heavy double doors, marching him directly past the horrified board of directors he had tried to impress. Brad was dragged out right behind him, still sobbing and pleading uncontrollably. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind them, abruptly cutting off their desperate voices. The main executive boardroom of Sterling FinTech was left in total, absolute ruins. Shattered crystal glass covered the expensive Persian rugs. Spilled champagne dripped slowly off the edge of the granite table. The projection screen continued to cast its harsh red light over the overturned leather chairs and the scattered legal portfolios. The empire Marcus had tried to steal was completely decimated, leaving nothing but a ghost town of corporate greed. The chaotic, shattered reality of the Sterling FinTech executive boardroom violently dissolves, melting seamlessly into the rich, warm amber liquid, swirling gently inside my crystal glass. The roaring sirens, the frantic shouts of wealthy investors, and the pathetic sobbing of my former executives all fade instantly into absolute, pristine silence. The transition is perfectly smooth, pulling you across time and space, directly back into the quiet sanctuary of my Atlanta penthouse. I take a slow, deliberate breath, letting the heavy silence of the room wrap around me like a protective cloak. I lift the heavy crystal tumbler to my lips. The aged bourbon burns exactly the way it is supposed to. It is smooth, sharp, and undeniably expensive. As I swallow the dark liquor, the camera of my life begins a slow, steady retreat. A gradual, continuous movement pulling backward away from the leather armchair where I am seated, taking in the sheer, untouched luxury of the space I call home. The sprawling city lights of Atlanta twinkle endlessly below my floor-to-ceiling windows, completely oblivious to the corporate empire that was just dismantled and devoured within their very grid. People often expect a grand, highly emotional climax when a marriage ends in deep betrayal. They expect screaming matches, thrown vases, and tearful, desperate pleas for closure. They expect you to fight tooth and nail for the affection and respect of a man who never truly valued you in the first place. Marcus certainly expected that. He banked his entire strategy on the assumption that I would be too blinded by heartbreak to notice the corporate knife he was sliding into my back. But raw, unfiltered emotion is a fragile and highly unpredictable weapon. It leaves you exposed. It makes you sloppy and reckless. The true absolute power in this world does not come from anger or broken hearts or vengeful screaming. It comes from the cold, mechanical, and entirely unsympathetic architecture of corporate law and raw, unrestricted capitalism. I did not need to raise my voice to destroy Marcus and Brad. I did not need to shed a single tear to prove my point. I simply used the binding ink of their own aggressive greed against them. I let the relentless, unfeeling machine of the federal justice system and high finance do exactly what it was designed to do. The system consumes massive liabilities. And Marcus, stripped of my strategic guidance and my foundational capital, was the greatest financial liability of them all. There was no dramatic, drawn-out courtroom trial spanning several months. The digital evidence I handed over to the federal authorities was far too absolute. Brad, terrified of spending the rest of his natural life in a maximum security facility, took a federal plea deal almost immediately. He surrendered every single asset he had ever accumulated and accepted a 12-year sentence for corporate espionage, wire fraud, and severe financial forgery. His desperate, weeping testimony served as the final inescapable nail in my ex-husband's coffin. Marcus, the charismatic visionary who truly believed he was an untouchable tech titan, was completely and violently bankrupted by the immediate debt call. His luxury cars, his secret offshore accounts, the lavish mansion he bought for his mistress, all of it was seized and liquidated by the federal government to satisfy the trust. He is currently serving 15 years in a federal penitentiary, entirely stripped of the wealth, the status, and the arrogant pride that defined his entire pathetic existence. As for Vanessa, she narrowly avoided jail time by turning state's witness, but she was left absolutely destitute. She was forced to return to the mediocrity she tried so desperately to steal her way out of carrying the permanent stain of a massive federal fraud investigation. Sitting alone in the beautiful quiet of my penthouse, I realize that I do not hate them. Hatred requires an active, continuous expenditure of emotional energy that I am simply unwilling to waste on people who no longer exist in my tax bracket or my reality. I do not harbor bitter resentment, and I certainly do not offer any form of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a weak, comforting concept invented to soothe the conscience of the guilty. I offer only the absolute, undeniable truth. They tried to take my kingdom, so I legally buried them underneath it. I did not just rearrange the corporate structure of a financial technology firm. I rearranged the entire natural order of my world, ensuring that those who attempt to feed on my brilliance will always choke on their own ambition. I am Nia Sterling. I am not a tragic victim of a corporate takeover. I am the apex predator of Vanguard equity. I am the sole architect of my own absolute power. I did not just survive the violent storm they tried to drown me in, I became the storm itself. I take one final, deeply satisfying sip of the bourbon. The warmth settles firmly in my chest. I lower my arm, letting the heavy crystal glass meet the polished dark wood of the side table with a soft, definitive click. The city lights outside my expansive windows continue to glow brilliantly against the night sky, but inside the penthouse, the shadows slowly stretch forward. The darkness quietly consumes the room, creeping over the leather furniture and the glass walls until everything smoothly, inevitably fades into absolute impenetrable black. The ultimate lesson from this story is that true power does not stem from loud emotional reactions, but from meticulous preparation and knowing your own worth. When faced with deep betrayal, you never need to seek chaotic revenge. Instead, simply fortify your boundaries legally, protect your assets, and let the sheer arrogance of those who underestimate you become their inevitable downfall. Never allow anyone to erase your hard work or dictate your value. True victory arrives when you reclaim your independence and build your empire on unshakable truth. Have you ever reclaimed your power? Share your story below and subscribe.